Most of you know that in ReZero, a lot of the important characters have very interesting names. For example, all of the Sin Archbishops are named after stars. Likewise, all of the Witches of Sin are named after asteroids. Now, this is of course really important because Tappei names them like this for a reason, and in the future of ReZero, we'll come to understand why this was done. Now, of course, that also corresponds to one of the most important characters in the show, and that is Satella. Back in the day, many people didn't really know what Satella's name stood for, and people assumed that Satella stood for the word satellite, which in reference to the Earth would be represented by the moon, because the moon is the Earth's natural satellite. Now, we didn't know if that was true, however, it was seemingly confirmed in the Mimgao If alternative universe that Tappei wrote this year. So for those that don't know, Mimgao If, or Gender Bent If, is an alternative universe where every single character is gender bent and the opposite gender. So Subaru is a woman, Felt is a boy, and so on and so forth. And this actually also applies to Satella herself, who is now a man. And Satella no longer goes by the name of Satella and instead goes by the name of Luna. And of course, Luna is of course a direct reference to the moon itself. Now, when it comes to the moon, I want to talk about different anime, and that is namely One Punch Man, because in One Punch Man, the moon is very symbolic. In fact, it's usually representing God, the idea that God is watching the world or the characters in the One Punch Man universe. And many times there will be sort of images of characters doing their own thing, and the moon will just be in the background, just sitting there watching ominously. And we've seen in the One Punch Man world that God has actually sort of risen up from behind the moon and shown himself. And this is the sort of idea I want you to think about, because in the ReZero world, we also have this aspect. Because in the ReZero world, you have observers, and Stride Valakia sort of talked about how there are observers, these sort of gods that play around with people as if they're chess pieces on a board. Cecilis also does the same. He talks about this idea of being on a stage and being actors. And lately in Arc 7, Chapter 75, Subaru also came to this idea of him having his own observer in the form of Satella, who is watching him. And of course, Satella lost sight of Subaru, and Subaru called out to her, and then she observed him and found him, and of course came to him. During the 10th anniversary, Tappei was asked what the most important arcs are in the series, and Tappei responded that it's the first arc and the last arc. Now, what's really interesting is that Arc 1 is actually very short, and it's when Subaru gets summoned. And Tappei has sort of indicated that Subaru being summoned specifically at that point of time might have had a reason, which we will find out in the future. Now, what's really interesting is that the epilogue of Volume 1, so the ending of Arc 1, has one of the eeriest and most ominous endings. And most of you will most likely not remember this, because I did until I reread the epilogue. Before I get into that though, on screen I have a chunk of text where Tappei talks about how the sort of lore was finalized when ReZero got an anime adaptation. Now, you can pause it if you want to read it, but I just want to sort of show you this, because if you look at ReZero's first episode, the title of the episode is The Beginning of the End and the End of the Beginning. I also want to bring your attention to Steins Gate, which is one of the better done time travel animes, and episode 1 is similarly titled, which is titled Prologue of the Beginning and the End, which is very, very similar to ReZero's first arc, first episode title, so keep that in mind. Now, taking all of this information about this weird prologue of the beginning and the end, Arc 1 being the most important, Satella being personified by the moon, we have the Arc 1 epilogue where Reinhard is sort of talking to the moon, essentially saying how this would be the last time they could look at the moon peacefully, which is really ominous considering the royal selection is 3 years. The only difference is that Subaru was summoned into the world, so why is Reinhard feeling uneasy? Now, we do know that Reinhard's perspective is a spoiler, and maybe one of the reasons why it's a spoiler is because Reinhard knows that there are observers. Satella is watching, Volcanica is watching. Again, this is just my theory, I'm not too sure, but Reinhard's perspective is a spoiler, so maybe he knows a lot more than he lets onto. Now, if we actually go on to the title of the epilogue of Volume 1, it's titled "The Moon is Watching," which again, it actually gave me goosebumps when I first read that, because now everything seems to make sense. Satella is the moon, and she is watching as an observer, watching what's happening. And of course, Subaru was summoned to this point in time because he needs to save the day. We do know from the Alec Hoshin side story that Hoshin and the heroes were on a journey to save the world, and it's obvious that they failed to save it. Of course, what happened was that we saw at the end of Arc 6, on top of the Pleiades watchtower, Volcanica was waiting there. We know from Stride Valakia that Volcanica is an observer, and of course, Volcanica mistook Emilia for Satella. Volcanica spoke about how he failed to act, which sort of resulted in some form of disaster, which we're unaware of what happened. However, he then tried to kill Emilia, who he believed was Satella herself. We know that, of course, there's a monolith on top of the Pleiades watchtower, which has 6 handprints. Of course, we can now work out that the 6 handprints belong to the 6 people that were on a journey to save the world. Of course, Flugel, Satella, Farcel Lagunica, Echidna, Reed Astria, and Alec Hoshin. We know from Alec Hoshin that he participated in some form of Great Flood, and many of you would know that the Great Flood is how Typhon died. And of course, this seems to indicate that Satella and Flugel and the rest of them were of course going around killing the other witches of sin, most likely to obtain their witch factors. And of course, something then went wrong and resulted in the entire cast of characters failing to, of course, complete their objective. This of course results in Subaru being summoned. Whether or not Subaru is Flugel, it's most likely that he is, but he's from a different point in time, which explains his lack of memories. And again, it goes back to the idea of the video title, the end of the beginning, which of course represents the end of Arc 1, which is the beginning of the story. However, it's also the beginning of the end, because this is now halfway through the story. After the adventures of Flugel and Satella, Subaru is now ending the long story after 400 years. And of course, Subaru is most likely the halfway point in the story. Hopefully in the future we'll see the previous history of what actually happened between Flugel and Satella, but that'll most likely come a lot later on.